My parents raised me and my sister, like, they didn't really talk about our Korean identity, even though it was pretty clear to us, but you don't quite understand how that works in the sense that, growing up in America, my dad always wanted to impress upon us, like, you're American, you're as American as anyone else. Like, you could become president because you were born here, right? Not to say that he really wanted us to have those kinds of aspirations, but he just wanted us to know that, you're really no different than anyone else. You are just as American as anyone else. And they also really emphasized us having this Chinese culture and this Chinese identity. I think that there was a lot of, but my parents also, they put me in Taekwondo, which is a very Korean thing, right? And, my mom could obviously speak Korean, and whenever my parents didn't want us to understand what they were saying, they would always be speaking Korean. It wasn't until I actually spent about 3 months in Korea before we moved to Hong Kong. I was living with my dad. He wanted me to kind of meet all my relatives there, that I kind of realized, like, hey, how come all my dad's relatives, like all his brothers and sisters, are Korean if they're Chinese? My grandma, interestingly enough, because of where she spent time in China, like Harbin was basically, if you think about during World War II, it was a Russian puppet state, right? The area of Manchukuo. And so my grandma actually was speaking, and they were around a lot of other Japanese families or people who spoke Japanese. So in fact, when I remember knowing my grandma when I was young, but then I didn't see her for about 10 or 12 years until I was in Korea, and she would attend church, like Japanese language church. And she preferred that over Korean, even though her Korean is perfect. And in fact, her Chinese was at that point pretty, she had forgotten a lot of it, I think. So that's kind of when you start having some questions about your own identity, right? You kind of start thinking like, well, so my dad, that your parents were both raised in Korea, but they both identify as Chinese. And so, but you don't really think about the significance of that. And I would say that, as you become older and then you become a little bit more in touch, and then you kind of realize like, okay, well, if my cousins are Korean and their families, like my uncles and aunts, identify as Korean, then does that make me part Korean? And then you kind of start thinking about that to a greater degree. And then I think it was more in college that I kind of became a little bit more, I guess you kind of take a little bit more agency or ownership of this identity, right? Normally in college, like, everyone's, getting here, and you try to find your own path, right? You try to find friends, you try to find certain circles. For me, it ended up being that Asian Greek life was something that ended up a path that I ended up taking. I never really thought it was something that I would want to do, but I do recall after being at UT for a few weeks, and I remember someone had, rushed me and was like, hey, I would really like you to join. And I was like, oh, that's not for me. I don't want to pay for my friends. I remember I said that to him. He said, okay, I'm just going to give you my pitch. And he ended up becoming one of my really close friends. I remember after a few weeks of being at UT, I kind of felt like there was more to college than just what it was. It wasn't just like going to class, like that was fine and all. And, I'd made a couple of friends, not that they weren't nice people, but I don't feel like they could totally relate to me in my experiences, so to speak, right? Especially because I was born in the US, but then I'd spent like an appreciable amount of time growing up overseas. And I think even growing up overseas and you come back to the US, there's certain things about your identity, right? You don't want to be considered like someone that's fresh off the boat that had just immigrated here. But if people ask you, oh, where did you go to high school? And if I say, I went to high school in Taiwan, they're like, oh, well, you speak English pretty well, right? Or like they'll assume like you're not from here. And I think I was really sensitive to that idea of being considered, someone that was on the outside. But I felt like I wanted to have more of, I wanted to have fun. And so I remember I got on Instant Messenger, like AIM. I don't know if you guys remember what that is, but I remember I told him, I was like, hey, do you think I could rush? Because I feel like there's, I'm missing something here. And he said, yeah, come out. And it ended up being one of the best decisions of my life. I think when I got to college, I felt like that's when you start kind of getting pushed to a certain direction, and I really became apolitical at that point in time. I think I was too busy, just trying to worry about school, having fun, working, and taking on all these other things that were staying engaged in the news was really not that important to me. What really changed was, I think, all the Asian American Studies classes I took. And every Asian American Studies class even if it was like a literature class, it definitely has a strong sense of social justice. And I think that was at the point in time where I became a little bit more aware, because a lot of the things that you learn about in an Asian American Studies class is this whole myth of the model minority. I think coming into college, I always thought like, oh yeah, I mean, everyone I knew who was Asian, like they were always like valedictorians, salutatorians of their high school. In college, taking those classes, I still didn't really become political. I remember even after I graduated college, like I was still very politically neutral. But at that point in time, our country was not as divisive politically as it was, right? Like, I mean, I remember Bush v. Gore, but it wasn't, like I was actually in the hospital with one of our pledges who had like had I don't know, like he started like having some kind of like breathing issues or something. We had to like take him to Seton over there on 38th in the medical center. And I remember that was when the election was going on, right? And obviously, as you guys know, with Bush v. Gore, there was a lot of, funny business with what was going on in Florida. And I remember there were some other people of color in the hospital, they were watching it and they were like, man, that's fucked up. That's so fucked up. But I didn't really care, like it didn't really affect me what was going on as far as like who was president, right? And I mean, I knew obviously who Bush was, and the fact that he was the son of the former president and that he was the governor of Texas, but that was about the extent of it. The morning of September 11th, my girlfriend at the time, her parents lived in Singapore. They were expats actually, and they lived in Singapore, and she had gotten a email or maybe even a phone call from her mom asking like, hey, are you okay? Because I think the first tower had just gotten down, like a plane had just ran into it. We didn't really know what was going on, right? And then she says, hey, is something going on? And I remember like waking up, I had I want to say a 9 a.m. class. It was either an 8:30 class, maybe it was an 8:30 class. It was a Tuesday, Thursday class, that's all I remember. And it was over at FAC, right? I remember it was AAS 314. It was Asian American Lit and Culture. It was a lower division class. It wasn't a big class. And I just remember, like, we still didn't know what was going on, but it's like, hey, it looks like somebody hit the World Trade Center or one of the towers.
It's 8:52 here in New York. I'm Bryant Gumbel. We understand that there has been a plane crash on the southern tip of Manhattan. You're looking at the World Trade
Center. Like a sort of a crashing sound, but I looked up quick enough to actually see something go into the building, but everything happened so fast I wasn't quite sure what I was looking at.
I remember later when I got home, I was talking to my friends and they had kind of come over and we're just like, wow, like this is really not good. Like, you really felt like you were under attack. At that point, I think someone had started to take ownership of what had happened, whether it was Al-Qaeda or I don't remember if it was the Taliban or not. And I think at that point we did know about bin Laden, right? But I remember those next couple of days where there was a lot of uncertainty. I just remember like, even talking to some of my colleagues from work or talking to my other students, like there was a South Asian American fraternity, right? And a lot of their guys, a lot of their fraternity brothers, they would always play basketball in Gregory. But that night of 9/11, there was not a single South Asian person in Gregory. Why? Because obviously they knew that people were going to be linking these attacks to people that were possibly South Asian or looked or sounded Muslim in terms of their names, and their parents probably told them like, hey, be careful, right? And so I remember the gym was, they were telling you, it was absolutely empty that day. Like none of those guys were playing basketball. And it was a very, there was a lot of uncertainty at that time. And I think, with Obama being nominated, I think that had a big influence on me and the way I lean politically, because I felt that this is someone that has a path not too different from my family's path here, right? His father was an immigrant, and although his mother was from here, I felt like, him growing up in Hawaii, I was like, and kind of like, the way he attended schools and things like that, I felt, well, there's someone that kind of, although he doesn't look like me, he seems to understand the path of what someone from my background looks like. And so I think that plus just, where I stood on a lot of like social justice issues, on a lot of criminal justice issues, right? I really felt more that it's not so much that I identified as a Democrat, but I knew at that point I was definitively not someone that would ever identify as a Republican. I think that when I declared as an English major, and then subsequently when I also added Asian American Studies as a major, when I started thinking like, well, what am I going to do with an English degree? And I think at a certain point I knew that grad school was probably something I would have to consider. And obviously there was a fair amount of pressure from my parents to also go to grad school. But I remember thinking, I was like, well, I really enjoy a lot of my faculty here, and I thought, like, is pursuing a PhD something that is feasible? And if I did pursue a PhD, what would that be? And I think I explored, like, I explored the idea of perhaps getting a master's or a PhD in English and Asian American Studies or something in regards to that. I think when I thought about where could I make the most impact, that kind of was for me when I figured out that, well, I think maybe I could make the most impact in law, right? I knew that given my cultural background, given that some of my experiences, like hopefully that would make me a little bit more of a suitable candidate to have more of a measurable impact. And so that was really why I decided to go to law school. When I finished law school, and I actually did a Master of Law at UW directly after finishing my JD, the economy was pretty much in shambles at the time, and so, yeah, I could have stayed, I think, and gotten a job working at a firm in Spokane, which is where I got my JD at, where Gonzaga is. But my first job coming out of after I finished my LLM program was working for the American Civil Liberties Union of Washington. And that was where I think, I think working for them had probably had the greatest impact on shaping a lot of my political and personal ideologies. And when you're working for a civil liberties organization, when you're out there, trying to protect people's, liberties, liberty interests, it gives you a much different perspective. And like I said earlier, I was working with a lot of communities of color that were, disparately impacted by the policies of the Patriot Act, right? Because I think the narrative that we saw after 9/11 was that the enemy could be around amongst us. It could be anyone. It could be people that we go to school with, and they become radicalized, and they're going to make an attack against us. So I think when you work in that environment, and largely my focus as an attorney had been working in litigation, right? Whether it was working in civil litigation, whether it was working in more complex commercial litigation, even as doing criminal defense. So I think when you are working in the throes of the legal system, right? When you're there on the front lines, right? Whether you're trying to pass legislation, where you're trying to, lobby other legislatures to pass certain legislation, when you're litigating these cases in the courts, when you're representing people, it really does give you a different type of perspective. I think you are a lot more in tune to the realities of life and the complexities of life, and kind of how different legal issues play out in areas, and how it affects Asian Americans in particular when you're talking about issues like family law, for example, or even criminal law to a degree, even in any types of civil cases. Now, part of why I moved back to Austin, I thought that there might be a possibility that I could teach, at the university, at least, at the undergraduate level. I saw a position open up, and so I decided to apply for it, and I reached out to the former director and just say, I'd be happy to write you a recommendation. I got in touch with some of my other, faculty mentors that were still here, and they were like, yeah, I think you'd be a great fit. And so, I did everything I could to put myself in a position to try and get hired on as a faculty, and then I did. I try to treat my undergraduate classes that I teach, in some ways, to a degree, I treat them like law school classes. Like, what I like about law school classes are that, because they do employ a Socratic method. So I think, the way I approach my classes is I think a little bit different, I think, and I've also compared notes with my faculty members, they think my approach can be a little intense, But I feel like ultimately, when I look at what my students and the feedback from my students is they really seem to enjoy it, right? And because I teach classes on identity, identity is inherently very subjective, right? And I think that, yes, it is also about reading and broadening your understanding of different approaches to identity or how people conceptualize their own identity. But ultimately, like, my experience is different from your experience, which is different from your experience and his experience, right? But ultimately, I think there are certain things that are shared, and to the degree that we can have a better understanding of each other, then I feel like it would make for a better world, so to speak.